Thank you. Great. Welcome. Yes. Welcome, everybody. As chairman of RUSI, it's a great pleasure to welcome you here tonight to the Royal United Services Institute and to the Duke of Wellington Hall specifically. Please turn your phones to silent if you haven't done so already. And in the event of an emergency, join the RUSI staff over there who will direct you to the entrance you came in or to the emergency doors on the right. The Royal United Services Institute was founded in 1831. The first Duke of Wellington was our first chairman. We claim to be the world's oldest think tank, usually. And we have here tonight one of the world's newest and deepest thinkers to think with this think tank, Yuval Noah Harari, and it's a great pleasure to have him here tonight. We will range more widely than our normal subjects of conflict and defense and security in which we specialize, although these will no doubt feature in our discussion this evening, because a discussion with Yuval is a discussion about everything that human beings have done or are doing or might do in the future. And he has gone from specializing in world history, medieval history, and military history to writing 3 acclaimed books about most of the things that we as human beings get up to. In Sapiens, his first book, he described our history, how we drove other species of humans to extinction and much else besides. And having passed through a cognitive revolution, an agricultural revolution, and a scientific revolution, we're now on the brink of the end of Homo sapiens, he wrote, as we move from natural selection to intelligent design. And then in Homo Deus, he described what our future might look like, how we might become unaccountable gods wreaking havoc on our own ecosystem, or have already become that in many ways, and we might divide into a society where some become superhuman beings. And now in his latest book, which is on sale with the others outside from Waterston's, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, he focuses on today's most urgent issues. So Yuval, welcome to RUSI, and welcome to our invited audience and to people watching us live streamed wherever you may be in the world. And I want to start with a point that is a very familiar subject to everybody here, but which you illuminate particularly clearly and mercilessly at the beginning of your latest book, which is what's happening to liberal democracy. You write that liberal elites are in a state of shock and disorientation. And here we are dealing with Brexit, with President Trump, with the Italian government. We are definitely in a state of disorientation. And you write that in 1938, though humans had 3 stories to choose from, in 1968 they had 2. In 1998 there seemed to be only 1, liberalism. From 2008, we're down to 0. So let's start with explain and expand upon that. And what, for those of us still attached to liberal democracy, what hope is there for us?
No, there's still a lot of hope that should be said from the beginning. But we talk about stories. And maybe the first thing to say is simply that humans, Homo sapiens, is a storytelling animal. We think about the world, about our lives, in terms of stories. Very few people think about the world in terms of numbers or equations or statistics. And this is the basis for almost all human cooperation, is belief in shared stories, which means stories are extremely important, at least in my opinion. And when we look at the broad history of the last 100 years, as you just described, we see a shift from a situation in the 20th century when politics was a battleground between huge visions about the future of humankind, huge stories that explained or claimed to explain everything that happened in the past, what is happening in the present, and what will surely happen in the future. You had three such big stories, the fascist story, the communist story, and the liberal story, and they got knocked out one after the other. Until at the end of the century, you had just one story standing, which is the liberal story, which caused a lot of people all over the world to think that that's it. That's the end of history, not in the sense that nothing else will happen anymore, that time will stop, but in the sense that we know it all. We now perfectly understand the past, we understand where we are, and we know where we are heading to. And we are heading towards a world of more and more globalization and liberalization, that democracy will be the dominant political system, that the free market will be the dominant economic system, borders and walls will get lower and even erased completely until all of humankind will become a single global community. And lots of people believe that, not only in the core Western countries, but all over the world. And then quite rapidly, over the last 10 years or so, people lost faith in this story, not only in the developing world, but above all in the core countries of Western Europe and North America. If 10 years ago, some governments were still trying to force this vision of history on other people around the globe, even at the price of war, now they're not even sure of this story in their own countries. And it's the most, I think, shocking and terrifying thing to switch from having one story to having zero stories. When you have two or three stories competing with one another, then you still don't know what will happen, who is going to win, who is right. You still have doubt. But to have just one story, you have certainty. There is just one thing that explains everything. There is just one thing that can happen. And this is the level of, maximum certainty. And then to switch to zero stories, this is much more frightening than having 2 or 3 or 4 stories. Because you don't have any explanation to what is happening in the world, and you don't have any vision for the future. And I think that what we see now in the world, above all else, is a vacuum of stories and visions. This vacuum is partially filled by old stories that seem to be making a comeback, like nationalism and like religion. But the main thing to say about them, and we can go more deeply into that later, they don't really offer a vision for the future. What characterized fascism and communism and liberalism is that they really had a vision for the whole world, for the whole of humankind. Maybe not a good vision, but still they had some vision. If you look at the rise of nationalism today or in the last few years, what strikes me above all is that it simply has no idea how to run the world as a whole. Nationalists can have very good ideas sometimes about how to run a particular country. But how should the world as a whole be managed? There is still a huge vacuum there. The most, at least I can understand, from what some nationalists are thinking, is that they think in terms of like a network of friendly fortresses. That you will have each country building walls and digging moats around itself to defend its unique identity, its unique culture, its unique ethnicity. But the different countries will still be able to cooperate peacefully to some extent. To trade, it will not be a return to the jungle of everybody against everybody else. But the problem with this vision of the world as a network of friendly fortresses, actually there are 2 problems. The first problem is that fortresses don't tend to be friendly, certainly not in the long run. Each fortress naturally wants a bit more security and sometimes territory and certainly prosperity to itself, even at the price of what the other fortresses want. And without some global values and global organizations and so forth, you can't reach an agreement. And the idea of friendly fortresses very quickly turns into warlike fortresses. The other problem, which is a new problem, is that the world now has three major challenges which are global in nature and simply cannot be solved or dealt with on the level of a single fortress, within the walls of a single fortress. These are nuclear war, climate change, and technological disruption, especially the rise of artificial intelligence and bioengineering. And it should be obvious, I think, to everybody that you can't stop nuclear war just within the walls of one fortress. You can't prevent climate change just within the walls of one fortress. And you cannot regulate AI and bioengineering just in a single nation because you don't have control over scientists and engineers in other countries. And nobody would like to stay behind and just restrict our own development if the other fortresses are not doing the same thing. So this is why I think that there is no real vision there. It's just something that fills the vacuum, but no vision. Yeah.
And your point, Yuval, is that liberalism it could have coped with those things, but it doesn't really have an answer to the ecological challenge, the climate change, or the technological disruption. And so even this cherished liberalism that has been the mainstream of politics for so long, faced with this, is in a bad state.
Yes, I mean, again, you can make some slight corrections to the liberal recipe. Then, okay, so people don't like too many immigrants, so okay, we can have stronger regulations on immigration and go back to the good old days of the 1990s or early 2000s with a bit more regulation on immigration. But in the long term, the deep meaning of the climate, of the ecological crisis, and even more so of the new disruptive technologies, is that we need to rethink the foundations of the liberal order. In terms of the ecology, the main problem is that liberalism is premised on the promise of economic growth, that you can basically satisfy everybody because the pie will just keep growing. And it's not impossible, but it is difficult to continue maintaining economic growth if you want simultaneously to fight climate change and ecological disruption. Again, it's not impossible, but it demands a lot of effort. And when it comes to the disruptive technologies, here liberal democracy is in a much even worse position, because I think, and again, we can discuss it more deeply, that the implications of the new technologies, especially, again, artificial intelligence and bioengineering, it undermines the very most basic assumptions of the liberal order about human free will, about individualism, about these basic slogans that the customer is always right, the voter knows best. The new technologies really undermine these assumptions. I still think that from the options on the menu in 2018, liberal democracy is the best option because it enables us to rethink and question and our foundational values and norms and try to construct a new system in the most open and accountable way. I don't think we can maintain the order as it is, but this is still the best order to try something new out of.
And you gave us really good advice in this book, which is be aware that you are bewildered, but don't panic, which I often used to feel like saying to colleagues in government, actually. And then you go on, though, to almost make us panic with this point that in your argument, the merger of information technology and biotechnology is quite likely fatal to democracy. And I think that this is quite a hard point for people to grasp in a way. We can see lots of things that are damaging to democracy now, and we can see to an ex-politician's eyes, the way social media has developed, which has really fractured how people, they no longer deliberate together, really, in a democracy. It seems to be very damaging. But you're introducing a much bigger argument, really, a more worrying argument, which is this technological change, which few people are going to want to stop, could be fatal to democracy. So would you like to explain why you think that's the case?
Well, it will be fatal to democracy as we have known it I think that the big advantage of liberal democracy over all other systems is that it is adaptable. It can reinvent itself. But for the way things are at present, or for the way things we thought about liberal democracy for maybe 2 centuries, the merger of infotech and biotech is fatal because, try to make a long story short, the crucial point is what happens when an outside system, an outside algorithm knows you better than you know yourself, knows how you feel, can predict your emotions, can manipulate your emotions, can predict your decisions, your choices, can make choices on your behalf. And this is true of the marketplace, where a corporation knows your choices better than you and can again predict and also manipulate your choices. More and more decisions, crucial decisions in people's lives, what to study, where to work, who to marry, whom to vote for. There is an algorithm out there that can tell you better than what you can tell yourself what to do. Certainly when it comes to politics, to think about a situation when the government knows you better than your mother. I mean, the idea of having somebody that knows me better than I know myself, we've all experienced that, or almost all of us experienced that when we were young children, and our mother knew us better than we knew ourselves. You're not angry, you're hungry, eat something. And this is very good when you're 3. But what happens when happens when you're 30, and it's not your mother, it's the government, and you could be all kinds of governments, not necessarily a liberal democracy. Again, people think it can never happen. Humans are too complicated. We have souls, we have spirits. No algorithm can ever figure out these mysterious things like the human soul or free will. But I think that this is 18th century mythology, which held on for 200 years because there was no technology to do it. But now, or very soon, we will have the technology to do it. And it will force us to rethink the fundamentals of things like the free market or democratic politics.
And it's quite bleak, isn't it, some of what you're saying, to put it mildly, what you're saying to us. Because one of the metaphors I really enjoy, one of the great things about your writing, if I may say so, is that you have very memorable phrases and metaphors that stick in the mind. And the one that stuck in my mind particularly from your latest book is the data cows. You say that cows used to be, the cows we now see in a field, in a farmer's field, used to be, they are the descendants of much more adventurous animals. And we have reduced them to this state of standing in that field and just processing food for us. And now we're doing this with humans, you say. That we are turning we're going to turn ourselves into biochemical algorithms that process data. That we take in emails and tweets and texts all day long, and we put some out as well. And we are just part of the data flow, no longer autonomous individuals. We will be the data cows. It's quite, what do we do about that? Do we say, well, let's stop technological development, which we can't really, which is unlikely we can do anything about that? How do people looking for policies and regulations try to find solutions to these things?
Well, there are 2 different questions. I mean, one is how do you formulate an alternative vision? And then there is the political question of how do you get people convinced of your vision and enough people and enough countries to actually make it work. So in terms of the first question of formulating a new vision, I don't think that's impossible. The first step is to acknowledge the realities, the biological realities of human beings and how humans make decisions and where human desires and choices really come from, and the enormous potential for both good and bad of the new technologies to really hack human beings. And it can go in all kinds of directions. I mean, the same technology can be used to give people the best healthcare in history. That there is some system that monitors your body 24 hours a day and can identify all kinds of illnesses from cancer to flu when they are just beginning, and it's very easy and cheap to take care of them. It's a system that can help people make better decisions in their lives. Again, if we talk about decisions like what to study or whom to marry or whom to vote for, people often make terrible decisions in these situations. And if the system works for you and helps people make, you need to decide what to study in college. Very often people make bad decisions and waste years and a lot of money and a lot of energy because they have distorted views of themselves, because they don't understand the field into which they are entering, whether it's ballet dancing or whether it's being a lawyer. They don't really understand what it will take later on during their career. And if there is a system out there that can make better decisions, that can be very good. Of course, it can be used for terrible things. The same system that monitors your body to recognize the beginning of cancer or flu can also mean that citizens in some countries like, I don't know, North Korea might have to walk around with a biometric bracelet that constantly monitors how they feel. And if they watch, I don't know, listen to Kim Jong-un give a speech and the biometric bracelet recognizes the signs of anger, that's the end of you. And that's feasible technologically, maybe not today, but in 5 years or 10 years, that's definitely feasible. And there are all kinds of governments around the world experimenting with the aim of creating what we can call a total surveillance regime, which is something far more extreme than even what you find in George Orwell's 1984, because it's a system that can look inside your body. In 1984, as far as I can recall, the system monitors only the outside, where you go, what you say, who you meet, but what is actually happening to your heart or to your brain, that's still off limits. But we are very soon will have the technology to have a really total surveillance regime in which you can survey the entire population down to the level of what's happening to your blood pressure and to your brain activity every minute of the day. And the big question is, how do we use this for good and not for evil? Again, the system, you can use the system to monitor individuals in the service of government. You can flip that and use it to monitor the government in the service of citizens, for example, to fight corruption. So the technology is neutral in this sense. It can go either way. The question is, how do we formulate the good vision and then convince enough people and enough governments to cooperate on that?
So the overall argument is our lives will be governed by algorithms, external algorithms, which could be under the control of an authoritarian government, a big corporation, or indeed no one might know whose control they are under. They could be under the control of artificial intelligence when no one is quite sure where it lies anymore. And maybe this would be a good point to go on to the points you make about artificial intelligence. You tell the story very well about what happened on the 7th of December last year, which most people haven't noticed yet. They were going about their business, or they were watching the news about Brexit, or whatever it may be. But just remind everybody what happened on the 7th when the AlphaGo Zero program started to play chess.
Yeah, so and almost every month or so we hear about a new achievement of artificial intelligence. So one of the latest headlines was when a new software for playing chess defeated the previous computer software for playing chess. And it maybe doesn't sound like news because it's been 20 years since a computer program defeated the human chess master of the world, Garry Kasparov. But what was amazing about the new software is that it taught itself how to play chess. It started basically from zero. They just programmed it, the basic rules of the game, and didn't teach it anything about strategy, about moves. It didn't have any access to previous games, to the centuries-old bank of knowledge about playing chess. It just played against itself and taught itself chess and strategies and so forth, and went on to defeat the previous computer world champion. But the most amazing thing is how long it took it to reach from zero knowledge to complete mastery, to be the top of the world. 4 hours. That's it. So, it's centuries of thousands of years of humans playing chess and passing their knowledge to the computers, and that's it, 4 hours. So it's still a long way from playing chess to taking over far more complicated tasks in the real world. But the writing is really on the wall. And as you say, I don't think we'll reach a point when we have like computer overloads. The most scary realistic scenario is that we might soon reach a point when, all the people in power, all the powerful positions are still occupied by human beings, not by computers. You still have a prime minister, you still have a CEO. But the prime minister chooses from a menu written by AI. For instance, the financial system is likely to become so complicated within the next 20 or 30 years and so fast-moving that no human being, we already now in a position when the percentage of humans who can honestly say they understand the global financial market is minuscule. Of almost 8 billion people on the planet, how many people really understand how the financial system works? Very, very few.
Well, the governor of the Bank of England's here, so hopefully he's one of them.
Yeah, so I said
but there aren't many others.
There are a few, but not many. Now, envision a situation in 20 or 30 years when the system is so complicated and so fast-moving that no human being is really able to understand it. So you have the prime minister, and an algorithm comes to the prime minister and says, "Sir, madam, we have a problem. We are facing a financial meltdown, and I can't really explain to you why, because you're a human, you won't understand it. And you have 3 options what to do, but I can't really explain to you any of them because it's too complicated. And you need to decide now because it works in milliseconds. So you still have a human figurehead, but in more and more fields, and it can be finance, it can be like terrorism, like algorithms being used to identify terrorists on the basis of more and more complicated patterns. And the patterns can become so complicated that, again, we reach a point when the algorithm tells the defense minister, this is a very dangerous terrorist, but I can't really explain to you how I reached this conclusion, but trust me. And this is not some bizarre science fiction scenario. We are in some fields very close to that point.
And actually, you tell a story in your book, I think, about a Palestinian who was arrested, who was erroneously identified in this sort of way.
Yeah, in Israel, we have one of the biggest laboratories in the world for surveillance, and it's called the Occupied Territories. And it's really a huge laboratory, and this is one of the reasons that Israel is one of the leading countries in the world in the development of surveillance technology. And there are glitches, like this case of somebody posting a Facebook post, and the algorithm mistranslated good morning as let's kill them. There are 2 words which are very, very close to one another. And of course, they went and arrested the guy. So this is a tiny, tiny example from what is actually happening right now. But you can really run with your imagination of where this can lead us in 10, 20, 30 years.
And this thinking of our normal work here at RUSI, this applies to military technology, doesn't it, as well? That normally now, in a democratic government, it's still a human decision to use lethal force. But soon we will find that, the next generation of warplanes doesn't have to have a pilot. Or that our ships could be attacked by a swarm of 1,000 networked objects. There is no way a human reaction can deal with that, and you have to have your artificial intelligence defense against that, and indeed artificial intelligence decision to launch your defense against that. And I think you say in your book that autonomous weapons are a disaster waiting to happen. Is there anything we can do about that? Because we would have to stop almost the whole development of military technology to prevent that, wouldn't we?
No, not necessarily, but certainly we are entering an AI arms race, which is leading us very fast towards a world of autonomous weapon systems. I think it can be a disaster for humanity, especially if these weapons are not in the hands of responsible liberal democratic governments, but in the hands of either dictators or all kinds of terrorist organizations or criminal groups and so forth. And the only real way to stop it is through strong global cooperation. This is one of the best examples I mentioned earlier.
Yes.
That we need global cooperation to deal with technological disruption. So the easiest example to give is killer robots or autonomous weapon systems. It's very, very clear that you cannot regulate these kinds of technologies on the level of a single country or even on the level of a few countries. If you have a treaty banning killer robots, autonomous weapon systems, only between, say, European countries and that's it, then very soon the European countries themselves will break their own ban because nobody would like to stay behind. If the Chinese are doing it and the Russians are doing it, we'll be crazy not to do it ourselves. And it's not enough to sign a treaty banning autonomous weapon systems. It's much more difficult than even with nuclear weapons, because with nuclear weapons, it's still quite difficult to have a serious nuclear program which is completely secret. You can't really develop nuclear weapons without the world knowing about it. But with artificial intelligence and autonomous weapon systems, it's much, much easier to have a completely secret program. And also, you can, of course, develop it in civilian context. Oh, it's not a killer robot, it's a self-driving vehicle. And just a few tweaks turn it into an autonomous weapon system. And for that, we need not only a treaty, we need real trust. It's not impossible. You can have such trust between even former enemies. If you look at France and Germany today, 100 years after the end of the First World War, today I think there is enough trust between France and Germany that if the Germans tell the French, trust us, we don't have a secret laboratory under the Alps developing killer robots to conquer France, I think the French will trust them, and the French have a good reason to trust them. It's very difficult to see, say, China and the US reaching the same level of trust. They are certainly not heading in that direction at the present moment. But unless we have this kind of trust, it will be almost impossible to prevent an arms race in autonomous weapon systems, which could be a disaster for humankind. Again, one of the problems with autonomous weapon systems compared with nuclear weapons is nuclear weapons, unless it's an all-out war, there is not much you can do with them. But with autonomous weapon systems, once you develop them, they are not just waiting to be used in a doomsday scenario. They can be used in a lot of other scenarios. So the kind of mutual assured destruction that prevented the use of nuclear weapons since 1945 is unlikely to be relevant for autonomous weapon systems. Once we develop them, they are much more likely to be used in a lot of contexts, unlike nuclear weapons.
But overall, you tell, and this is another alarming diagnosis that you give there, but overall you also tell us to get war and terrorism in perspective, don't you, really? The number of people, the proportion of people in the world who die from violence is smaller than it's ever been. Far more people, I think you say, are killed by sugar than by gunpowder these days. And you ask us to have terrorism in perspective. Another of the metaphors I really, that sticks in my mind from your, that I've heard you, seen you write more than once, is the terrorist is like a fly in a china shop, you say. It cannot on its own push over a single piece of crockery. but it can get into the ear of the bull that is sitting in the china shop and make that bull so angry that it stands up and wrecks the china shop. And this is quite good advice to governments and media organizations to have things in perspective. Do you want to expand on that?
There's a big difference between terrorism and warfare. Terrorism, until, at least in the shape that we've seen it so far, again, autonomous weapon systems can be a game changer, also in the field of terrorism. But at least until today, it has been the ability of terrorists to actually kill people, take over states, wage war is extremely limited. If you look at the number of people actually killed, it's minuscule compared to the number of people killed by air pollution or car accidents or obesity. As far as I can remember, at least in a place like Western Europe, more people die from nut allergy than from terrorism over the last 10 years. You should fight the nuts before you fight the terrorists. And part of it is because of the immense effort invested in fighting terrorism. If we invested no effort in fighting terrorism, then yes, there will be more casualties. But also there is a reverse logic there, that the power of terrorism really comes from the overreaction of governments and of armies to the terrorist threat, which is like the bull in the china shop. If you look at the history of the Middle East in the last 20 years, then it wasn't the terrorists who wrecked the china shop. It were the bulls who became enraged by the terrorists. And now war is a very different situation. We are living still in the most peaceful era in history, also in terms of war. And despite the deterioration and the rising tensions in the international system over the last 5 years or so, we are still living in the most peaceful era in history. And as a military historian, as a specialist in the Middle Ages, what amazes me about things like Brexit, like the Scottish referendum, is how peaceful everything is so far. In previous centuries, to decide the question like whether Scotland should be independent of the government in London and whether Britain should be part of a huge European political system or not, it could only be decided through a major war with thousands, maybe millions of people being killed and wounded and displaced. And now, so far, it is decided by very peaceful referendums and elections in which a few people may be killed by fanatics, but not millions. You don't need to wage battles. Also, if you look at the rise of right-wing populist parties, like in Hungary, like in Poland, like in Italy, so far, they are still far, far more peaceful than their predecessors a century ago. Like I watch what is happening in Hungary, you become very worried if you start hearing Viktor Orban saying things like, the wicked Romanians are holding sacred Hungarian lands in the Banat and Transylvania, and we need to go to war to reclaim these lands. And if you see hundreds of thousands of Hungarians volunteering to die in the trenches in order to recapture the Hungarian lands of Transylvania. And so far, it's not happening. I don't know what, maybe in 5 years we'll see something like that. And the same when you look at Italy. I wrote quite extensively about the Italian involvement in the First World War. Italy entered the First World War in 1915 in order mainly to conquer/regain the lost Italian territories in Trento and Trieste. Quite a small piece of land, today partly in Italy, partly in Slovenia. The Italians lost about 500,000 people, soldiers killed, and more than 1 million soldiers wounded in a struggle over that. Now, do you think that Italians today would be willing to, I don't know, have 50,000 soldiers killed to capture a few dozen kilometers from Slovenia? So far, it doesn't seem like it. So with all the really frightening and disturbing rise of the nationalist demons, they are still nothing like what they were a century ago. They can become like this very quickly. But so far, we are still in a far better situation.
So the danger then is not that the world, so much that the world will break down in violence, as that we will become, in living longer, often more secure lives, we will become imprisoned in this kind of matrix, part of the data flow, and possibly divided in a different way. I think you argue in Homo Deus that we might see the upgrading through intelligent design in the future, the upgrading of humans through bioengineering, of some humans who have less need of all the other humans in the age of artificial intelligence, and that new divide opens up in society between those healthy and wealthy enough to be upgraded and those who are no longer relevant.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the long-term dangers. I mean, the technology will, on the one hand, make it possible to start enhancing and upgrading humans, and on the other hand, especially the rise of AI, will make more and more humans economically unnecessary, useless, and therefore also politically powerless. And the world or humanity might have, different parts of humanity might have different futures. And we might see really a process of some kind of speciation in Homo sapiens. This is a long-term danger. The immediate danger is that we will get embroiled again in these nationalist battles, and we could see a return to the extreme nationalism of the 19th century and early 20th century. And that involves two big problems. First, we'll have all the old problems of things like the First World War, but in addition, we will have the big problem of not being able to do much about the new technologies. I mean, the next 20, 30 years are crucial for our ability to regulate the new technologies and prevent the worst outcomes, whether it's autonomous weapon systems, whether it's massive unemployment and the rise of a useless class, whether it's the use of bioengineering to start enhancing humans in all kinds of maybe frightening ways. And we won't succeed in preventing these dangerous scenarios if we spend the next 20 years fighting about the borders between different nations and levels of immigration and things like that.
So we should be focused on things like the ownership of data, and which I think you say is the big political question coming up, the regulation of the transparency of algorithms. Understanding these problems might allow us to get a grip on them before it's too late.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest questions is, as you say, the ownership of data. Data is now becoming the most important asset in the world. If in ancient times it was land, so a lot of political conflicts were about the ownership of land, and then machines replaced land as the most important asset in the last 200 years. So a lot of politics was a struggle about who controls the machines, who controls the factories, the mines, the train system, the electricity system. Now data is replacing machines as the most important asset. And I think that one of the biggest political questions now is who owns the data. And most people and most parties and most governments are hardly even aware that this is the question. So the data is being harvested and monopolized by a few corporations and a few governments, whereas most governments and political parties and voters and citizens, they are hardly aware that A, this is happening, B, this may be the most important thing that is really happening right now.
And in a few minutes, we will open up for some questions from our guests here. I just want to ask you about a couple of other things. I want to ask you about animals. You write a lot about the animal world. You've written about how there were at least 5 other species of humans, and we managed to get rid of them all. Then we got rid of a lot of other things. And then you write about how we mistreat animals today, particularly other mammals, particularly farmed animals. And you argue very convincingly that in mammals as in other mammals as in humans. There has to be a great bond, for instance, between mother and infant, and that is something we rupture every time we undertake modern farming method tens of billions of times over. Do you think we will look back, will people look back in 100 years on our age like we look back on the Middle Ages as a barbarous, ignorant time when we didn't really understand what atrocities we were committing?
It could be, again, I don't know who will dominate the world in a century. But certainly if you think in terms of what kind of atrocities are committed today in the world, you look back at things like slavery, and you think, how could people actually do it? And not like, the people who wrote the American Declaration of Independence, as everybody knows, many of them had slaves. How can you just not see the gap there? And you have very intelligent people who didn't see the gap. And what's happening today, which is like that, so one of the best examples is the way we treat other animals. So there is a chance that in a century, people or entities will look back on today that how could intelligent, compassionate, wise people just not see what they were doing on a daily basis to billions? It's not, like isolated cases. It's an entire system of billions and billions of animals. And especially as now basically the scientific discussion is over. You can still hear some people who are not scientists say things like, well, cows don't mind. Cows don't have a mind, they don't have consciousness, they don't feel pain, or even if they feel pain, they certainly don't have emotions, like a bond between a cow and a calf. This is all, you're humanizing cows. But now there is a very wide scientific consensus, at least in the relevant fields in the life sciences, that certainly emotions, the basic emotions, like the bond between mother and child, is common to all mammals and probably to many other species. So the scientific consensus is widespread. The scientific discussion is really over in this respect, but it's still, like in many other cases, what's obvious to scientists, it's still far from obvious to the general population, to the politicians, to the market.
And when we think about what we should, if we agree with your diagnosis on all of these issues about how we should live differently or what we should think about doing in the future, really, as I see, you're calling for two things. One is that we have to outrun those algorithms in our own minds. We have to invest in human consciousness in whatever way, in meditation, in whatever way we can, and that is an individual task. And you're saying, as you've mentioned several times tonight, we have to globalize politics, or find a global solution, which is why nationalism is not the answer. But on that point, one has to admit that international politics is not currently going in a constructive direction. We're probably going in the opposite direction at the moment. What if political leaders refuse to globalize themselves? What if, does technology at least give us all the chance to do something anyway? What if 5 billion people who are connected together now technologically all decided they were going to do something about ecological collapse, about the treatment of animals, about whatever it may be? Is there any, should we take any hope in that? And do you think this redefined liberalism might somehow call on that?
Well, first I want to emphasize there is no contradiction between this global thinking and nationalism. It depends on how you understand being a good nationalist, being a patriot. If you think that being a good patriot is taking care of your compatriots, of their security, their welfare, then I think that good patriots today should be globalists. Because the only way to really protect the security and the prosperity of fellow citizens is through global cooperation. So I think it's very dangerous to think in these kind of either-or terms, that either I'm a nationalist or I'm a globalist. No, I think that today, really good nationalists should be globalists.
But we're not getting more, we're getting a bit less global in our unity and outlook, aren't we? Even with whether we're nationalists or whatever we are.
Yeah, but so as for, if the political system is going in that way, can people just use, say, some technological platform to unite and do something else? I don't have a strong belief in that. I tend to be skeptical of, like techno-utopias. That, we can just invent some algorithm and platform and circumvent the entire messy political process and system. It doesn't work like that. We have enough, I think, experience from the last 20 years that many of the utopian visions of the 1990s about what the internet will do in terms of connecting people, they turned out to be completely wrong. Even when there is partial successes, like you look at the Arab Spring. So yes, you had something like the Twitter and Facebook revolutions. You could use Twitter and Facebook to get 100,000 people into Tahrir Square and topple Mubarak. But the problem then is that you needed old-fashioned politics to fill the vacuum. The Facebook and Twitter platforms were not up to it. So you got two very, very old-fashioned organizations, the Muslim Brotherhood and the army, filling the vacuum, and it became a struggle between them. So if you want to have a big one-time demonstration or even a revolution, yes, maybe you can have like a technological shortcut. But the really difficult part of building a political mechanism, you don't really have these shortcuts.
No, I think I agree with you, but I'm looking for the hope, that the politician's mind looks for the, well, there's got to be an answer, and there's a great prize to the person who finds the answer.
Well, I mean, again, to finish this part on a hopeful note, I would say two things. I mean, we just kind of marked the 100th anniversary for the armistice that ended the First World War. And if people back then could see the situation of Europe today, despite Brexit, despite the rise of populism, they would say this is an absolute miracle.
Yes.
So looking at the last 100 years of European history, I think, can give us a lot of hope that people can rise to the challenges. And similarly, if you think about the last time that we faced like this major technological disruption in the shape of nuclear weapons, in the 1950s and 60s, maybe the same think tank right here, you would have somebody sitting here and talking about the nuclear age and a lot of gloomy people in the room being convinced that we all know how it ends. It ends with a nuclear Armageddon which destroys human civilization. And it didn't end like that. The Cold War ended peacefully. So I think it's not inevitable, but it is possible that we will manage to rise up to the new challenges also.
Well, let's turn to our audience here and see if we have some, I'm sure we will have some questions. And if I pick you out, please, a microphone will come to you, and do say your name or organization if relevant. So Jonathan, one of our senior figures here at RUSI.
Hi there, Jonathan Isle from the Institute. I want to ask you about how linear these projections are. I'm just sort of reminded, you mentioned the First World War, of Norman Angell and his lovely book on the Grand Illusions, which 4 years before the First World War predicted that there can't be any war because economies are so interrelated. He got a Nobel Prize, but not much else. There are certain linear projections. Admittedly, you did define certain ways around it in terms of common action. But how robust are your projections, and did you take into account the possibility that the linear projection is absolutely the wrong one?
How linear and how robust then?
No, I don't believe in linear projection. History certainly doesn't move in a linear fashion. What I try to do, at least in my writing, is not to predict the future. I think it's both impossible and also, futile. Because if you predict the future accurately, you can do nothing about it. What's the point of prophesizing something which is inevitable and you can do nothing about it? So what I really try to do is map different possibilities in the hope of influencing even a little the choices people make in order to prevent the worst outcomes. So when I say something like artificial intelligence might drive millions of people out of the job market, create a useless class, create an immense and very unequal society, this is not a prophecy. Like, this is definitely going to happen. It's just a very dangerous possibility, which we can do something about today by adopting the right policies. And it's the same when we talk about the threat of war. I don't think that a new global war is inevitable. I don't think it's impossible either. I think that, again, Norman Angell was correct in saying that it would be a terrible disaster for humankind to enter into a global war. He was absolutely correct about that. It's just very unfortunate that humans tend often to make very bad decisions, both as individuals and as collectives. And again, what strikes me about many of these decisions is really how unnecessary they are. That if you look, say, at the Second World War, then you think, what went through the heads of the mind of the Germans and the Japanese? I mean, for me, really one of the most amazing things about the Second World War is that 20 years after the war, the losers were more prosperous than ever before. So why did they need the war? I mean, if you can be so prosperous after losing, the greatest defeat in history, it's obvious you didn't need a war in order to be prosperous. But they just made the wrong decision. They thought without a war, without conquering China, without conquering Russia, they will never be able to prosper economically. And they were 100% wrong about that prediction, but unfortunately, they thought like that.
Let's take another question. Yes, I think I can see Baroness Neville-Jones back there.
Pauline Neville-Jones. You don't talk much about the distribution of power. I mean, one of the things that it seems to me is the case that digital age has democratized power to some extent inside societies. And so what people do collectively counts more. Mm-hmm. What assumptions do you make about education? I mean, wouldn't it be possible to imagine a more optimistic scenario where decent education means that actually people take more responsibility and make better decisions? Mm-hmm. I mean, that seems to me to be a possible line of development, which doesn't lead you to a doomed scenario. Mm-hmm. It leads you actually to a better and a more interesting society. And I would have thought that the fourth industrial revolution is going to increase the tendency of actually making, increasing the economic as well as the political power distributed at many levels of society, instead of just at the top.
Right. Yeah.
Education and responsibility throughout society.
Two different points. I mean, if we're talking about jobs, then yes, definitely there will be new jobs as the result of the AI revolution. The big question is whether all the people who lose jobs will have the ability to educate and retrain themselves to fill the new jobs. So, what?
So we better not have heckles because of the microphones.
So this is one big question. Some people might, but not all people. And you could have a division according to countries, in which some countries have the both economic and social capital necessary to retrain their population to take advantage of all the enormous opportunities of this revolution. But then other countries might be left completely behind with no way to progress, because the main thing that enabled countries to progress in the 20th century was cheap manual labor. And this won't work in the 21st century. So you could have an even more extreme division of the world than what we saw in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution. The other point is about individuals taking responsibility for decisions in their lives. Now, there is a very optimistic scenario that AI and these monitoring systems that constantly track what we do and how we feel actually enable us, empower us to make better decisions. Like, to take again the example about deciding what to study in college. So when you need to make that decision, maybe a system that has been following you from childhood presents you with a far more realistic view of your abilities, of your potential, of the opportunities in the job market, of the difficulties of the different training courses. And then you can make a much better decision, much more knowledgeable decision about your future. That depends first on whether we develop the right kind of AI systems, and secondly, whether people have the education and really the motivation. Because, again, the danger is that people might just be lazy and just learn to follow whatever recommendations the system gives them. Like, to take a real example, one of the most important abilities of humans is to look for information. Today, a lot of people have completely renounced their personal abilities to search for information. They just follow slavishly the algorithm. The truth is the first 3 results of the Google search engine. That's it. And the only way I know how to look for information is just ask Google. And it doesn't have to be like that. I mean, the internet gives us immense abilities to look for information. But a lot of people don't utilize these abilities. And they actually are in this sense, their skills of looking for information are far lower than 20 or 50 years ago.
Malcolm Chalmers. A microphone at the front is coming there behind you.
Thank you so much. And I particularly enjoyed the way you started by saying so much of recent history has been explained through competing stories and the declining number of stories. But one of the stories in our field, which is still very powerful, is nuclear deterrence. And it's one that's shared by communists and liberals during the Cold War. It's one that's shared by India and Pakistan and Israel and North Korea today. And maybe that shared story helps the peace, I don't know. But I was reflecting on what the impact of AI decision support might be in that area. And I mean, I would be deeply pessimistic about the chances of international cooperation on killer robots of the sort you suggested, and also I think in relation to nuclear weapons. But it reminded me of the 1983 film War Games, where a teenage hacker gets into the Pentagon computer, thinks he's playing a game of global thermonuclear war, but has actually started one. And that's the pessimistic side of the film. But then the film ends, spoiler alert, with the computer running the algorithm, running all the options multiple times as machine intelligence many years ago, and coming to the conclusion nobody can win global thermonuclear war, so the only thing left to do is not to start. So I guess the question is, maybe in a world in which leaders rely more and more in future Cuban Missile Crisis or future September 1939 scenarios, maybe major war will be less likely because they'll be more reliant on machines.
There are many different scenarios here. One thing is that hacking and AI are likely to destabilize the nuclear deterrence because once you cannot really, you don't know for sure if you really have control of your own weapons. You don't know for sure if the other side has control of, like a missile is launched from Russia to Britain. Maybe it's the Russians, maybe it's North Korean hackers, who knows? Maybe it's a fat kid in Macedonia, as some famous person said. So who knows? And what do you do then? Then nuclear deterrence collapses. If you don't really know who is controlling the different weapons. Another danger is that nuclear deterrence is based on this idea that nobody can win. But what happens if technology develops so rapidly that you gain some new wonder weapon and you think that now you can win? And it can go both ways. Either you think you can win, or the other side is afraid that they are losing their last chance. That in 10 years or 20 years, they will be so behind that they can't do anything anymore. So they have to act now. So these are the two very dangerous scenarios in which AI can destabilize nuclear deterrence. And then the third scenario, which I'll already refer to, is that with AI, you can have a lot of extremely dangerous and violent attacks which are not an all-out war. You can take down entire systems in a country, and nobody is sure who is doing that and why. So it's a if nuclear deterrence is a kind of super rational chess game between just two players in which everything is clear and every move you know who is making it, then a future scenario is like this completely hazy situation in which lots of things are happening and nobody is sure about anything. And that's a very, very pessimistic situation to be in.
There's just time for a couple more questions. There's a lady at the back there, and then we'll come down to the front row again here.
Hi, my name is Claire Hajjaj. Thank you for a fascinating talk. The politicians of today are grappling with what we all believe are the biggest issues of our time. You know, should we be in Europe or not in Europe? Should we have immigration or not? Hayek or Keynes? All of these issues. And AI is a side issue to be dealt with later. Mm-hmm. So if you were speaking directly to governments, what would you be telling them to do now to prepare? That's one question. And a second related question is, you discussed the scenario where the whole democratic process is called into question because we have algorithms who can vote for us, and therefore why have elections? That democracy is the dominant political system in the West, has its strengths, but it also has its weaknesses. Can you imagine a scenario where the advent of AI and that kind of technology could prompt maybe a much needed rethink on how we approach the political process?
Mm-hmm. Well, about the first question of what to do, there are many things that can be done, but the first essential step is to build trust. Again, the obvious thing is you cannot regulate it on the level of a single country. You need strong international cooperation, you need strong international trust in order to do anything meaningful about AI regulation. So the first step is to build that kind of trust. Without this, we can have a lot of very nice ideas about what kind of AI to develop and what kind of AI not to develop, but we won't be able to enforce it because we'll be in a kind of race to the bottom that everybody says, yes, we don't want to do it, but we can't trust the other guys not to do it, so we must do it first. So this is the most important first step. What was the other question again?
What political systems might turn into with AI? Could it be something better?
It could be something better. Again, it's like, any technology can be used in many different ways. If the AI systems are served to empower the individuals and to survey the government, for example, to fight corruption, then this can really strengthen democracy in a new form. But again, we need to realize the immensity of the challenge and the fact that we have very little time to confront it.
And Nikolai Tangent in the front row here, right at the front.
Thank you. How do you think the relationship between the US and China will pan out?
I don't know.
He was trying not to make predictions.
I don't know. I mean, again, it's one of the most dangerous developments now in the world is the beginning of an arms race between the AI, between the China and the US, especially in the field of AI. 3-4 years ago, hardly anybody talked about it. Now we are really in an arms race. Certainly, you see it from the side of the Chinese government. The American government is far less aware of this arms race. I mean, at present, in a curious way, it's an arms race which much of it is actually between a government on one side and private corporations on the other side. But the US government is also coming on board and starting to realize what is happening. And this is extremely dangerous because this almost guarantees the worst outcome. And I think that, it's not inevitable. We can reach a situation of real trust and cooperation, but for that, you need to build trust. And at present, we are going in the opposite direction. And this is one of the most frightening developments now in the world. And the really sad thing is that it's not inevitable. It's not really necessary. It's not like a law of nature that there must be a clash and an arms race between China and the US. But this is what is, we are on that course, and at present the situation only gets worse and worse.
And Yuval, finally, is there anything we've not asked you about that you were burning to tell us about this evening?
No, I think we covered quite a lot of ground.
We've covered the... Okay, we'll take that. In that case, we will allow the one other question then. So I referred to this earlier, and you say to outrun the algorithms, we have to know ourselves.
Yeah.
I think you say, actually, people wonder whether you're out of reality in 2 hours meditating, and you say, actually, that is reality before you go back to all the tweets and emails and puppy dog videos and things like that. Expand on this point, and then we'll close.
Yeah, so I mean, like the oldest advice in the book is to know yourself. For thousands of years, you have all these philosophers and saints and prophets, whether it's Socrates or Jesus or Buddha or Confucius, going around telling people, know yourself better, really understand who you are, what's going on in your mind, why do you make the choices that you make, what's really in control of you. And this was always a very good advice, which most people never followed, but it was a good advice. But throughout history, you did not have real competition. If in the days of Socrates, you did not make the effort to really get to know yourself, you were still a black box to the rest of humanity. Maybe not to your mother, maybe not to your spouse, but to the rest of humanity, you were a black box. But this is no longer the case now. As we speak now, from your mobile phones or whatever, there are all kinds of corporations and organizations and governments that are very busy right now trying to hack you. And to hack you means to get to know you better than you know yourself. And once you reach that point, they can predict you, they can manipulate you, and you won't even realize this is happening. The easiest people to manipulate are the people who believe in free will, that I'm making all my decisions out of my free will, so nobody can really manipulate me. And the belief in free will was all good and well for centuries, but now it's becoming really dangerous because it makes us incurious about ourselves. If you really believe that every decision you make, every choice you make in life reflects the free choice of your soul or spirit or whatever, then you think you know yourself perfectly. What else do I need to know about myself? And it's kind of a barrier, a curtain, to really starting to explore your inner reality. If you realize, no, I know actually very little about what's going on in my mind, like the next thought that pops up in your mind, or the next desire that pops up in your mind, where did it come from? Why do I think about these things? Why do I want this and not that? And you start realizing this is the result of all kinds of biological mechanisms, genetical mechanisms, outside influences. Then you also become much more curious about yourself. And one way to understand meditation is simply a systematic observation of what's happening inside you to start having a much more realistic understanding of who am I, where do all these thoughts and emotions and desires come from, is it really me, is it the influence of this or that? And again, it's for me one of the most shocking. I started meditating when I was doing my PhD in Oxford in history, 18 years ago. And like it was a shocking, the first great shock was that I know almost nothing about myself. And, you know, to give maybe a simple example, it often happens that, I don't know, you have a big test tomorrow, or you have a big presentation tomorrow, you have to speak on the Today Show tomorrow. And you go to sleep at night, and you say, I must get a good night rest. I have an important test tomorrow. And suddenly, all these thoughts and worries coming up to your mind, and you say, shut up, I need to get rest. And you can't. And in a way, this is a little like meditation. You don't want to do it. You want to fall asleep. But you have this stream of thoughts and emotions and worries coming up, and you realize, I have no control over it. I can't tell it, just stop. I can't direct where it is going. And meditation is like that, but much, much more systematically and deeply. To like, maybe you go for a course for a retreat for 10 days, and for 10 days, not just for half an hour before you eventually fall asleep, but for 10 days, you just observe all the sensations and emotions and thoughts that are coming up in you. And for me and for almost anybody I know who went to do such a meditation course, it's really a shocking experience. To maybe for the first time, take a real direct look at what is actually happening inside me. And this is far more interesting and far more being in touch with reality than all the tweets and all the emails and all the funny puppy videos on YouTube.
That was a good final question. Thank you for that. And thank you for that answer. And thank you to everybody for coming tonight. I'm sorry we couldn't get in all the questions. If you could just stay in your places as we finish just for a moment while I take Yuval for much earned refreshments. I'd be very grateful. And thank you so much for joining us tonight, because there are many people here, including me, who have read hundreds of books and pamphlets and blogs, probably thousands of them. But despite the fact we've read all of those things, your writings do make us think about new things and new ideas, and maybe re-engineer our own brains and maybe look deeply into ourselves, as you've just advocated. And so to do that and to do it to millions of people is a great achievement, and we pay tribute to you for that, and thank you for being here at RUSI tonight.
Thank you.